Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with a kind of unique video. In today's video, we are going to discuss and then place every single player in the NFL into a tier in terms of how likely they are to be in the Hall of Fame once they retire. Now, when I say every player, I don't literally mean every player in the NFL. There are 53 players on 32 different rosters. I'm not going through every single player. Instead, we're just going to talk about the players that actually have a chance, whether that be surefire Hall of Famers or guys that are on the borderline or even guys that maybe probably aren't going to make it, but they do deserve to be remembered as tremendously good players. The tiers from top to bottom in terms of most worthy of being in the Hall of Fame to least worthy of being in the Hall of Fame are first ballot, meaning that you will go into the Hall of Fame the second you are eligible. Lock, meaning I believe you will be a Hall of Famer, even though you might not be a first ballot type of player. Good chance is someone that I believe will probably eventually make it in, but it might take 3 to 5 or 6 years in order for them to get in. 50-50 is a tier for players that I'm not sure have done enough to get into the Hall of Fame. And typically those are going to be older players towards the tail end of their careers, now that their primes are kind of done and behind them, and their resume is like right on the edge for me. If healthy is the next tier, and effectively that's for younger players that have established themselves as some of the best players in the game. So if they stay healthy, then they will make the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. Outside shot is also a pretty self-explanatory sort of tier. Generally, these are guys maybe on the tail end of their prime where not sure they've done enough. However, if they can extend their prime for another 2 or 3 years and then have some quality play after that, then they would move up into a higher tier, most likely. The last 2 tiers are too early. Again, pretty self-explanatory, where the player is too young or they've only really had 1 good year of play in order to kind of get themselves into maybe the Hall of Fame discussion. So those are guys that have broken out recently or very young players, like within their first 2 to 3, maybe even 4 years into the league. And finally, we have the Hall of Very Good, which is the first tier we will talk about. And those are players that I think are very, very good players that are probably not ever going to be in the Hall of Fame. And to give you an example, even though he was a little bit before my time in terms of me getting into football and actually being able to follow the game, Nnamdi Asomugha is the perfect player for the Hall of Very Good, because for 2 or 3 seasons he was arguably the best corner in the NFL, and then he went and signed with the Eagles and was a subpar player. That stretch is worth remembering, but probably not worth immortalizing into the Hall of Fame. Now, I do somewhat have a little bit of a rationale for what the Hall of Fame standard is to me, and it is pretty self-explanatory with what I've got on the screen right now. It is important to note that this is not the case for quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are judged on a different metric system for me. So in order to be a Hall of Famer, in my opinion, you've got to be one of these types of things. You have to be a top 10 player at your position for 7 years, or a top 5 player at your position for 5 years, or in more outlier cases, a top 3 player for 3 years. Now, all of these have a little bit of an asterisk, which is outside of your prime, you're still a good football player. And I also understand that this does kind of inherently go against players that are longevity type of players. So, for example, Frank Gore is probably going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's, I believe, third on the all time NFL rushing list. I do not believe Frank Gore was a top 10 running back in the NFL for 7 seasons. I think if you look at the stats, if you look at who was in the NFL, I don't believe that is the case. I think he had a 4 to 6 year run where he was probably a top 10 player, but he was never a top 5 player at any point in his career. And he played for forever, which allowed him to accumulate up these stats that are going to get him into the Hall of Fame. Now, Frank Gore probably should be a Hall of Famer because it's very, very difficult to play, I believe, 16 years in the NFL and be productive in quite legitimately 15 of them. Like, he was a productive running back for 15 of his 16 years in the NFL, unless he missed a year with an injury that I'm forgetting. So even though my rationale does kind of have an inherent bias against players that have longevity but were never quite at that top of the peak, doesn't necessarily mean that I am going to disregard those players. Because this is not a hard and fast rule, but it is a general guideline that I'm going to be using throughout this video as just a general sort of internalized opinion that I have. Now, for the quarterbacks, this is a hard and fast rule. So, in order to be a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback, in my opinion, you have to have been a top 12 quarterback in the NFL for more than 7 years. That's a pretty generous area here. That's a pretty good position to be in if you're a top 12 quarterback, but it's not unrealistic in terms of its feasibility, so to speak. Now, to go along with being a top third of the league sort of quarterback for 7+ years, you also have to have won a Super Bowl or a MVP. Now, I'm going to give you an example here, okay? If you took the MVP away from Matt Ryan, I would say no, that's not a Hall of Fame quarterback. But he has that MVP, so I'm going to say yes, he is a Hall of Fame quarterback. However, to use another example of a retired player that's still fresh in a lot of people's minds, in my opinion, and I'm perfectly aware that this is probably a hot take, but in my opinion, Cam Newton is not a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback. Was he a top 12 quarterback in the league at points in his career? Yes. However, he was kind of just on the cusp of that without the one MVP season. If he didn't win the MVP that year, even if he put up the same numbers and the same stats and they just gave it to somebody else that year, I don't know who was in the MVP conversation, but if they just gave that the award to a different player, I don't think anybody would be saying Cam Newton is a Hall of Famer. He had a tremendous career that you could argue he was robbed of because of injuries and poor coaching and poor training and sort of oversight of his body that allowed him to get just beaten down over the course of his career. You could argue that that is the reason why. However, there are plenty of players that probably would have been all-time greats had they not gotten hurt. And that's the sort of category that I've put Cam Newton in my opinion. I don't believe he had the longevity to be considered a Hall of Fame quarterback, even though he did have the peak to be considered a Hall of Fame quarterback. Okay, cool. Now that we've got almost 10 minutes of exposition out of the way here, there's only one thing left for me to say before we get into it, and that is to ask you to like this video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and go ahead and drop a comment down below if you disagree with me on any of these players or the tiers that they are in. Also, don't be afraid to let me know if I forgot someone, because there's a very real chance that I did. So the first tier is going to be the Hall of Very Good. I've got this broken down into two parts here, so let's just real quickly kind of list through the names, and then we'll go back and talk about them each individually. Joe Thuney, a guard for the Chiefs, who's currently on that team and a very, very good player. Probably at this point in his stage, the Hall of Fame has left his vision in terms of feasibility. DeForest Buckner is also probably someone who's on the outside looking in of the Hall of Fame, interior defensive lineman for the Colts. Speaking of the Colts, Ryan Kelly, their longtime starting center, is also someone that is probably on the outside looking in, as is famous rivalry here between the Colts and the Patriots. Matthew Judon, an edge rusher for the Patriots, who had a very good peak for that team that ended a couple years ago. Speaking of peaks, Tre'Davious White, for like a 2-year stretch with the Buffalo Bills, was arguably the best corner in the NFL. And then they changed schemes, and he dramatically fell off. Kind of a similar career path to a Nnamdi Asomugha, now that I think about it. Trey Hendrickson is probably the one guy on this section of players that I could see move up in terms of the tiers here the most easily. Now, injuries have played a role in his career. However, he is still, I think, in his prime. He's just on the tail end of it. So if he can put together another really, really good season this year and maybe the year after that as well, I think he could potentially change the conversation surrounding him a little bit. However, for right now, I'm keeping him in the Hall of Very Good category. The next player here is maybe the most underrated player of this generation of football in Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett is a very, very good player. But I don't think you can realistically say he was ever a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL, although I do think he has spent the vast majority of his career in the 11 to 20 range. Last player on this section of the list here is Levante David, a linebacker for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Levante David is someone that it would not surprise me if in real life he ends up being a Hall of Fame player, because I know a lot of players in the league think that he's dramatically underrated, and I would agree with that to an extent. However, I don't think he fits my definition of what a Hall of Famer is. He's the model of consistency and just playing at a high level for a very long time. However, I'm not sure that he was ever particularly like a top 5 or maybe even top 7 linebacker in the league outside of 1 year, which I believe it was his second year in the league, when they blitzed him a little bit more and he ended up with 7 sacks on the year. However, I think that was probably the only time in his career where you could argue legitimately that he was a top 5 linebacker in the NFL. Rest of the time, I think he's probably somewhere in the 8 to 12 range. And if I can't like consistently say you were a top 10 player, then I'm probably just not going to put you into the Hall of Fame. Okay, moving on to the next group of players here. Tyrann Mathieu, a safety for several teams, but most recently the New Orleans Saints. He's a good player. You could argue maybe one of the most influential players to come out in a long time. He is a pioneer of the slot defender position in terms of the way that is used in the modern NFL. However, injuries as well as misuse at times has taken a toll on his career from a outside objective-ish sort of look at it, to the point where he's probably not a Hall of Fame player. He just lost too many of the years in his prime. And it kind of stings because he was one of my favorite players in the NFL for a good bit there. Up next, also for the Saints, Derek Carr, quarterback. Yes, he was very bad this past year. Cool. I get it. I understand it. Don't let this past year ruin the total perception of his career, because he was legitimately a top 12 quarterback in the NFL, probably for 7 or 8 years. So hypothetically, if he could win a Super Bowl or an MVP, which that's probably not going to happen, but hypothetically, if the Saints were to win a Super Bowl with him being their quarterback, I think we would have to look at him as being more part of that conversation. But I don't think that's very likely to happen. So I've got him here in the Hall of Very Good. Hassan Reddick is another player that, kind of like Tyrann Mathieu, had just got absolutely misused early on in his career. Had Hassan Reddick been an edge rusher, I think we would be talking about him as like a lock to make the Hall of Fame, and maybe even pushing into like the first ballot Hall of Famer type of player, because these past 2 years where he's probably on the tail end of his prime, he was dominant for Philadelphia, a fantastic player for them. So if he hadn't wasted the first 5 or 6 years of his NFL journey in the desert, I think this would be a different conversation surrounding his career. But ultimately speaking, he's probably someone that is just going to be remembered as sort of a what if kind of player. Brian O'Neill, a right tackle for the Minnesota Vikings, is one of my favorite players in the NFL. Very, 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 very good. But has kind of the past 2 years, I think, been hurt. And also, the play did kind of drop off from 3 to 4 years ago when he made the one Pro Bowl, but he should have made it the year prior to that too. But he was someone that at one point in time probably would have been on the if healthy track to make the Hall of Fame for me, because he was so good. He legitimately might have been a top 3 or 4 pass blocking offensive tackle in the NFL. Very, very good player. Aaron Jones for the Minnesota Vikings is another player that I think is going to be on the outside looking in, unless he can continue the level of play or have a little bit of a resurgence here in Minnesota behind what I think is, in all honesty, a better offensive line than what he has had the past few years in Green Bay. And speaking of Green Bay, David Bakhtiari, left tackle for the Packers, he was arguably the best offensive lineman in the NFL for a period of time, and then injuries just completely derailed him and his career. He also might have signed with somebody. I don't remember. You can go ahead and call me on that if you want to in the comments. I don't know if he's signed anywhere or not. But when I made this graphic, he was not signed. Last two players, DJ Moore, wide receiver for the Bears. Now, I think he's only 28, or maybe he's turning 29 during the season. So he's in his prime right now. Probably should have made the Pro Bowl this past year. But this is a guy that, through no fault of his own, is probably just not going to be thought of as a Hall of Famer. And I kind of feel for him in that sense, because he had no quarterback in Carolina for the majority of his career. And then he goes to the Bears and doesn't have a quarterback this past year. And even though he balled out and I think probably should have made the Pro Bowl, he didn't. He didn't make the Pro Bowl. And when you're talking about stuff like the Pro Bowl, I haven't really talked about it, or All Pros, or stuff like that, because they're not as important for this section of the video. But they're not the end-all be-all, but generally speaking, if you're being voted to a first team or a second team All-Pro, you're probably a top 5 player at your position. And if you make the Pro Bowl, you're probably a top 10 player. Even though there are exceptions to that rule, the fact that DJ Moore hasn't made a Pro Bowl or an All-Pro at this point in his career, where we are on the back half of what is likely going to be considered his prime, I think this is unfortunately a player that is going to get lost in the rebuilding years of Carolina. Kevin Byard is the last guy that I have in the Hall of Very Good category, and this is just a guy who was a consistent quality starter, had a few really good years, made some Pro Bowls, but was not consistent or playing at that high enough level, in my opinion, to be considered in the Hall of Fame conversation. The next category is the too early category, or tier, as I've sometimes referred to them. And the first player in this tier is Justin Herbert, the quarterback for the Los Angeles Chargers. So again, with quarterbacks, of which there are plenty in this tier, it is kind of hard to say if they're going to be Hall of Famers or not, because it really comes down to is if their peak is good enough to get the team to a Super Bowl or to get an MVP. Now, I think it's very likely that Justin Herbert is going to get an MVP at some point. Just the way that the media talks about Justin Herbert, I feel like he's going to get the MVP at some point. And he's also probably going to be a top 12 quarterback for more than 7 years. He's been a top 12 quarterback for 5 years now, I think. So he's already pretty much got that checked off. Also, I'm going to skip around here. Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow, I'm just going to get the quarterbacks out of the way here. They're in the same boat. Trevor Lawrence did have a down year this past season. However, his receiving core was horrible. And they got much better there, in my opinion. So I think he's going to reestablish himself as legitimately a guy that is going to be very, very good. Joe Burrow had that run to the Super Bowl. He has also kind of been the only guy to really be able to go toe-to-toe with Patrick Mahomes consistently. So he is someone that I think maybe at some point will get that Super Bowl ring, or maybe an MVP too. I don't particularly know about that, but right now it's just too early to say that. He's also been hurt for 2 years of his career, so it's just too early for us to talk about Joe Burrow in that conversation right now. Now, the not quarterback version of Josh Allen, the edge rusher for the Jacksonville Jaguars, he is someone that has had a very interesting career arc, because he came into the league, was very, very good, made the Pro Bowl his rookie year, and then kind of disappeared for 2 or 3 seasons. And then 2 seasons ago, like the second half, he really turned it on, and it seems like he had finally found a scheme that was going to use him properly with the Jacksonville Jaguars under Doug Peterson. And now, this past year, he was brilliant. He was a very, very good player, made the Pro Bowl, and he is on that trajectory, assuming health and consistency, to be in that conversation later on in his career. But right now, it's just too early, and he's been so up and down throughout his career as well. I can't really put him in that conversation right now. Quinnen Williams for the Jets, an interior defensive lineman. This is someone that I think, now that Aaron Donald is out of the league and Chris Jones is also kind of getting up there, this is someone who, entering his prime here, either this year or maybe within the next few seasons, is someone that could take that next step and be, oh yeah, this is the best interior defensive lineman in the NFL. Like, really, 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 really good player. He is someone that I think probably will be in that conversation after his prime, but right now, I can't put him there. Antoine Winfield Jr. And this is kind of tough because he is a free safety, and only one free safety makes the Pro Bowl every year, which is ridiculous. That's like, there should be at least 2 or 3 safeties that make the Pro Bowl every year, because they separate free safety from strong safety when it should just be 3 safeties, or maybe probably honestly 4 safeties that make the Pro Bowl every year, but they don't do that. I don't know why. I think it's dumb. But he does have, I believe, 2 Pro Bowls, if I'm not mistaken. as well as almost universally being considered a top, I'd say 3 to 5 player at his position in terms of safeties in the NFL. I don't really think anybody is going to put him outside of that. So he is young enough to the point where his prime could be the next 5 years. And if he makes another 2 or 3 Pro Bowls, then I think, yeah, he's probably in the Hall of Fame. But right now, it's just too early to make that assessment. Same thing with Kyle Pitts. Made the Pro Bowl as a rookie because they threw him the ball a lot, and then they decided to not do that the past few seasons. But now with Kirk Cousins, I think he's going to establish himself as one of the best tight ends in the NFL. But we haven't seen it yet, so he's in the too early category. Landon Dickinson for the Eagles. Still a exceptionally young player. I think he's 25 or 26 and has made Pro Bowl the past 2 seasons and is one of the best guards in the NFL. But again, it's still just a little bit too early to put him in that Hall of Fame discussion right now. So the next 2 players we've got are both of the Cowboys' corners. Deron Bland broke out this past season and played at a very high level. Trayvon Diggs was the same story 2 years ago. However, he was hurt this past year. Both of these players, hypothetically, if they get 10 interceptions every year, they're gonna be first ballot Hall of Famers. So I'm not sure that level of production is going to follow both of them, but it wouldn't surprise me if one of them established themselves as a legitimate top-tier corner in the NFL. But it's still just too early to make that assumption. Same thing with Jordan Love. He's almost in the same boat as the other quarterbacks as well that we talked about on the previous list. So, yeah, it's just too early. I mean, 1 year looked really, really good, but it's too early. Up next, we've got 4 Detroit Lions players. Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta are guys that after year 1, they both made the Pro Bowl. And coming out the gate and looking the way that they looked, they might end up in that conversation a lot quicker than I think I anticipated as a Lions fan. Aiden Hutchinson had a good rookie year, took the step forward this past year to play at a legitimate top 10 edge rusher caliber sort of player, but it's only 1 year of that. It's too early to talk about him in the Hall of Fame discussion. Amon-Ra St. Brown was almost in the if healthy category, but ultimately I've only got him at 2 seasons of playing at the level that he needs to be at in order to be in that conversation. So by definition, it's too early. So, if he has another year like this, he's probably going to get moved to the if healthy category. And the last player in the too early segment here is Jalen Johnson, the cornerback for the Bears. Again, entering his prime right now, was very, very good last year. I think a top 5 corner in the NFL this past season. The year before that, he was a good player, but not really a top 10 player, probably not even a top 20 corner in the NFL, but a very, very good player still. This year made that leap, and if he can continue to play at that level for the remaining 3 or 4 years of his prime, then we're going to have that conversation about him. The next tier of players on this list is the outside chance tier. These are usually players that are towards the tail end of their career, or injuries have kind of riddled their career, or they kind of toiled in obscurity for a little bit too long, which is the case for this first player that I'm going to talk about, and that is Laramie Tunsil, left tackle for the Houston Texans, formerly for Miami. He did not get the respect that he deserved when he was in his early days in Miami, and also his early days after the trade to the Texans, because I think most people thought the Texans overpaid in that trade. And maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know, but they got a franchise left tackle. And for the past 2 or 3 years, which has really been his prime, he has been probably a top, I would say, 6 or 7 offensive tackle in football. And that's a really good place to be for Laramie Tunsil. The problem is that nobody really is talking about him like he's that good. Every now and then you'll get somebody that's trying to be a little bit different, and they'll be like, oh, Laramie Tunsil is actually the best or second best left tackle in the NFL. But for the most part, they don't typically mean that. I just think they're trying to be different. And I wouldn't say that Laramie Tunsil is the best left tackle in football either, but he's got a good chance to be top 5. I'd have to look down in the list and think about it a little bit, but he's up there. And the sad part about making the Hall of Fame in the NFL more so than in other leagues, your popularity as a player does really kind of matter. Like, there's a reason why Reggie Wayne isn't in the Hall of Fame yet. Because Reggie Wayne was never anybody's favorite player growing up. They had Marvin Harrison, and then they had Peyton Manning, and he was too good for most people to be like, oh, he's my favorite player. Whereas somebody might say something like Dallas Clark. You know what I mean? And that's kind of where I see Laramie Tunsil being, unfortunately. I think if people start to talk about him more, and this sort of prime of his career lasts into his early 30s, he will turn 30 just before the season this year, then that outside chance might be more of a 50-50 or good shot sort of thing. But as it stands right now, I think it's an outside chance sort of situation. Also for the Texans, Stephon Diggs, wide receiver. This is a player that I think has kind of gotten screwed by the fact that the league is so pass happy right now, and that so many wide receivers are getting to the 1,000-yard mark now. Because Stephon Diggs, when you watch the film, is a very, very, very good player, and he's been a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL for probably the past 5 or 6 years. But I would say this year there was a little bit of a step backwards for him. And going forward, it wouldn't surprise me if he took even further steps back, especially considering that Houston has a plethora of options to throw the ball to. Now, that's just ultimately my opinion on the matter, but I think Stephon Diggs is just sort of someone who's going to be remembered as like a diva wide receiver, almost like a Chad Ochocinco type of player. Even though I do think if he continues to play at the level that he has played at the past 5 or 6 years for another 2 or 3 years, he's probably just going to have too many numbers and just be too good for people to not talk about him like that. But right now, it's in the outside chance tier. Next player is Orlando Brown Jr., the left tackle for the Bengals. He made 4 Pro Bowls straight from 2018 to 2022, or 2019 to 2022, rather. But I believe almost all of those he was a right tackle for. And when he moved to left tackle, it's not that he got worse, but it's that, generally speaking, teams put the better tackle on the left side. So he got knocked down like a whole tier and a half in terms of rankings, because he was now being compared to the position where there were more good players. And because of that, they really haven't, his career trajectory has really kind of changed to where he, as a right tackle, was like, oh, this is one of the best, maybe the best right tackle in football. And he's going to make Pro Bowlers because he's playing the right tackle, and there's not a whole lot of really good players at that position right now, to kind of like a Taylor Decker sort of situation where he's like a solid left tackle, but he's never going to make the Pro Bowl because there's like 7 to 10 players that are just flat out better than him at the left tackle position. And if he had stayed at right tackle, I think this would be a different conversation. But he got moved to left tackle, and the standards are higher there. I just don't think he's going to get the accolades necessary to be considered a Hall of Fame offensive tackle. And we're actually going to skip down to Saquon Barkley here, and then I'm going to talk about the 4 quarterbacks I've got on this slide here all together. And Saquon Barkley is someone who I think had stayed healthy through his career, because he's had effectively 3 seasons just destroyed by injuries, and he's, I think, only been here in the league for 6 seasons. And he's made the Pro Bowl the other seasons. I think he's got 2 or 3 Pro Bowls, and was arguably the best running back in the NFL for those years. A phenomenal talent. He's still the best running back I've ever seen in terms of like being a running back prospect. An elite caliber player. But he's been hurt half of his career. He's had, I think, 2 season-ending injuries, and this past year he was just kind of hurt all the time. So half of his career he's just hurt constantly. Now, he is going to the Eagles, and they do have probably, in my summations, the top 3 offensive line in football, even though there is question marks at the center position. But still a very, very good offensive line. If he can stay healthy, he's going to be productive. And maybe if he could put together another 2 or 3 years of high-level production, he's still kind of young enough to maybe be able to do that without getting hurt. I don't know. I can't count on it. But that's really the only scenario where I could see him getting into that conversation, would be if he has 3 or 4 years of high-level production without injury. And I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I think Saquon Barkley will likely be remembered as one of those players where you look back on and you're like, man, if he could have stayed healthy, it would have been so, so different. All right, the 4 quarterbacks that I've got here on this section of the outside chance tier are Kyler Murray, Kirk Cousins, Jalen Hurts, and Dak Prescott. I didn't really know where to put Jalen Hurts, and I decided to put him in outside chance because I don't necessarily envision him, without taking a leap in play that I can't know is coming, winning an MVP. And I also can't really envision the Eagles winning a Super Bowl unless it's this year, because they've got a lot of question marks all over this team and older players. And yeah, they're very, very good, and they've done a good job as influxing with young talent the past few years. But they're going to have to replace Darius Slay and probably find 2 new safeties and maybe a linebacker and maybe the other cornerback position with James Bradbury pretty soon. And then half of their defensive line contributors are going to be out the window because they're getting old this year. And then on offense, the tight end position, Dallas Goedert is getting up there, and you're going to have to replace Lane Johnson as well. And you don't particularly have, in my opinion, a long-term answer at running back. Not that there necessarily is a long-term answer at running back. But the real kicker is that Jalen Hurts is making a ridiculous amount of money. He's making like 20% of the cap. And when you're paying the quarterback that much, unless that quarterback is Patrick Mahomes, you're not going to win the Super Bowl because you're going to have to make sacrifices at other positions. I didn't mean for this to just become a Jalen Hurts conversation, but Jalen Hurts is the player out of all of these that I am most willing to move into a different tier, whether that's like a 50-50 tier or a good chance tier or potentially even a lock if he does win the Super Bowl this year, because I think that could end up happening. Kyler Murray and Kirk Cousins, I think, are in the same tier of, these are both older quarterbacks now, and they've never played at a high enough level to legitimately be in MVP conversations. And also, I don't think their teams are anywhere near the Super Bowl. Atlanta, maybe in 2 or 3 years, but then you got to ask, okay, what's Kirk Cousins going to look like in 2 or 3 years? Also, is Kirk Cousins even going to be there after 2 years? They might just cut him so that they can start Michael Penix. There's a lot of question marks surrounding both of those guys, and I'm putting them here in the outside chance because, yeah, could they go on a run and win a Super Bowl and get to be that Hall of Fame type of player or win an MVP? Yes, that could happen, but I don't think it's a very likely outcome. And the final player is almost the exact same as both of those guys, but Dak Prescott for the Cowboys. I think Dak Prescott, at this point, he's become so overrated that he's actually underrated at this point. Because Dak Prescott is not a top 5 quarterback, but he sure as hell is a top 10 quarterback. Like, there's no conversation about him being outside of the top 12 quarterbacks, where you have to be in my definition of what a Hall of Fame quarterback is. Like, he's been there the past 5 or 6 years. So there's no question that he was in that tier either. Okay. But ultimately, I don't think the Cowboys are going to win the Super Bowl anytime soon because they can't even win a playoff game. And I don't think he's ever going to win an MVP either. He's also, I believe, 30 years old, if not right around there. So this is someone that's maybe got another 3 or 4 years of actual prime quarterback level play, and the athleticism is going to start tapering off here pretty soon. Moving on to this second slide here, Elton Jenkins, an interior offensive lineman, is somebody whose career has gotten decimated by injuries, but when healthy, he's one of the best guards / tackles / centers in the NFL. Very, very good offensive lineman. Jair Alexander is someone that's been very, very consistent at the cornerback position. He's consistently been like on the edge of being a top 10 corner in the NFL. And generally speaking, those guys make the Pro Bowl. And he's kind of made the Pro Bowl a couple times, I believe, but he's kind of been just on the outside a couple times too. I don't really see him ever genuinely getting into that conversation. Jared Goff, quarterback for the Lions, he's a little bit different from the other 4 quarterbacks that I talked about in the last tier. And it's because if he's going to move anywhere, it's most likely, in my opinion, going to be either lock or Hall of Very Good. I don't think there's any nuance in his career. Either he wins a Super Bowl with the Lions, and then he's a Hall of Fame quarterback because he won a Super Bowl with the Lions, or he doesn't do that because he's not going to win an MVP, and then he's not going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback. Because I don't know if he's had 7 years in his career where he's been a top 12 quarterback in the NFL. I think he's probably had 4, if I'm just thinking off the top of my head. And with the level of quarterback play in the NFL right now, he's kind of borderline top 12, most likely. And in most seasons, that's probably where he's going to be. Also, we don't know what he's going to look like when Ben Johnson finally takes a head coaching job somewhere. I don't know. But I think there's less nuance with Jared Goff's game than there is with some of the other quarterbacks. Montez Sweat is someone for the Bears. Same thing with Tremaine Edmonds, except for slightly different because Edmonds actually made 2 Pro Bowls, should have made 3 Pro Bowls, but it's whatever. Tremaine Edmonds was a top 5 linebacker in the NFL when he was with the Bills. I don't really think that there's any case to be made that he wasn't a top 5 linebacker in the NFL when he was playing with the Bills. He made 2 Pro Bowls and then missed it 1 year because he kind of just tapered off. I don't really know what happened that year. His second to last year with the Bills. And then his last year with the Bills, he was the first alternate. I thought he was significantly better than C.J. Mosley that year. I thought he should have just made the Pro Bowl that year. But that's not what happened. I don't get to control the Pro Bowl. But he is someone who is also still young. I think he's only 27, but I'm not positive. And he could hypothetically make a couple more Pro Bowls. I think the Bears are going to be that it team this year. So he may just go on a run here where he's going to make some Pro Bowls and get into that conversation. But right now, he's not in that tier. Joey Bosa is also someone whose careers have gotten just derailed by injury to the point where I don't really think at the end of his career he's going to legitimately be in the conversations for the Hall of Fame. Okay, so the next tier is if healthy. And these are players that I believe, if they stay healthy and continue the level of play that they are on right now, I think they make the Hall of Fame. There's not a whole lot to say beyond that. So I might give a little thought here or there with all of these players. But for the most part, it's pretty much just stay healthy, keep doing what you're doing, and you'll get there, in my opinion. And there's a lot of players in this tier because about half of them are not going to stay healthy. And probably another like 20% on top of that are not going to continue the same level of play that they are on right now. First player is Max Crosby, edge rusher for the Raiders. Again, he was in the conversation for Defensive Player of the Year award. They rightfully gave it to Myles Garrett this year. He was the best defensive player in football. Sorry, Steelers fans, you are wrong. Myles Garrett last year was better than TJ Watt. But he was ultimately kind of on the outside looking in of that award. I'm talking about Max Crosby again. But yeah, anyway. Rashawn Slater has already had seasons where he's been hurt and missed the whole season. So not great, but man, when we saw him that 1 year as a rookie, he was arguably a top 5 offensive lineman in the NFL that year. Creed Humphrey is another guy, stays healthy. He's maybe, honestly, he's probably the best center in football right now. So just stay healthy, keep doing what you're doing. You're good. Same thing with Patrick Surtain. He's, I think, worst case scenario, a top 3 or 4 corner in the NFL. Just keep doing what you're doing. He'll make the Hall of Fame, probably. Jeffrey Simmons, a little bit of an underrated guy for the Titans, but he's probably not in that tier with, Dexter Lawrence and Quinnen Williams, where they're pushing the envelope for best interior offensive lineman in the NFL, but he's like right below that. He's like in that 5 to 10 tier ranking. Very, very good player. Derrick Henry, if he can stay healthy and get over 10,000 yards, which he should do this year, I think he only needs like 500 yards. And maybe if he could get to 100 touchdowns, which I think he only needs 10 to get to. I may be wrong on those numbers, but it's somewhere around there. There's a good chance that Derrick Henry is going to become like the first Hall of Fame running back in a good while. Because honestly, there was Adrian Peterson, and then there was like nobody for a long time. And well, Frank Gore, you could maybe argue, but we have already hashed out the Frank Gore discussion. But there was Adrian Peterson, and then there was like nobody. And then Derrick Henry came out and ran for 2,000 yards. And I think that honestly should get him into the Hall of Fame either way. But if he can get to that 10,000 yard mark, which no one's done, I believe, since Adrian Peterson did it. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. And then also the 100 touchdowns. It's just longevity at that point is too high. He's a very, very good player. Should make it. Sauce Gardner for the Jets. Fact of the matter is that, again, he's in that conversation for best corner in the NFL, and he's in his second year. He has 2 Pro Bowls and 2 first-team All-Pros, I believe. So I don't know what kind of trajectory he is on, but it's sure as hell the Hall of Fame. Last player on this list is Josh Allen, the quarterback for the Bills. More so because I think at some point the NFL will give him an MVP award. I don't really see any scenario where Josh Allen is, I wouldn't say universally, but I think most people would probably rank Josh Allen number 2 in terms of quarterbacks in the NFL right now. I mean, Lamar Jackson's in that conversation as well, but he's already got 2 MVPs. I at some point, I think Josh Allen is going to get his. He also may or may not win a Super Bowl. Again, when you're paying your quarterback that much money, unless you're Patrick Mahomes, it's really hard to win the Super Bowl. Micah Fitzpatrick, safety for the Steelers, is another safety that's just gotten bent over by these nonsensical rules regarding the Pro Bowl and All-Pro voting. And he's a free safety, undoubtedly, but there's only one player per conference that makes the Pro Bowl as a free safety. And, he's gotten there a couple of times. I think he has 3 Pro Bowls. I'm not positive, though. I think he has 3 Pro Bowls. So if he can sneak in there once or twice more, get to that, 5 number, I think you're looking pretty, because I do think voters for the Hall of Fame will look at this and realize, oh yeah, the Pro Bowl and the All Pro votings are kind of biased against safeties, because they're only really letting one or two players, maybe three, get in every year. So, Micah Fitzpatrick, the fact that he's done that several times already just shows you how really, really good of a football player he is. Nick Chubb has had two season-ending injuries at this point, I believe. One in college and then one here in the NFL that were just devastating knee injuries. And if he stays healthy and is the player we saw before this second knee injury, I think he could get into the Hall of Fame, because the fact of the matter is that who was the best running back in the NFL when he was healthy? It was either Nick Chubb or Derrick Henry. There was nobody else really in that conversation. Now, part of that was because somebody a little bit lower on this list was hurt during that stretch of time. But otherwise, there probably would have been three players as opposed to just two players in that kind of conversation, in my opinion at least. Jamar Chase has been fantastic since he was a rookie. Very, very good player. Fred Warner has also been just an elite caliber player since he came in the league, basically. Nick Bosa, another guy like that as well. Christian McCaffrey, if he can stay healthy and put together another couple of seasons like he had last year, which Christian McCaffrey is already the exception to every rule about running backs in existence. So why wouldn't he be able to stay healthy and keep producing like this? So I hope that can happen. I think he could get himself into the Hall of Fame discussion if that happens. Jesse Bates, safety for the Falcons, elite caliber safety. I think it was a terrible mistake for the Bengals to let him go, but they had to let him go. They couldn't pay him and all of the offensive pieces, so I get it. Tristan Wirfs for the Buccaneers has also been a phenomenal player at right tackle and left tackle for them. He's played at a Pro Bowl and All-Pro caliber at both positions, which is extraordinarily difficult to do. Chris Lindstrom, also for the Falcons, is someone that right now is, I would say, almost universally considered the best guard in the game at this point. He certainly was this past season. Phenomenal football player. If he could stay healthy and keep playing like this, he's going to walk into the Hall of Fame. A.J. Brown for the Eagles is also probably a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL. Very, very good player. Dexter Lawrence, now that Aaron Donald is out of the league, he has retired. He is the best interior defensive lineman in the NFL. Micah Parsons is probably a top 5 defensive player in all of football, and probably a top 10 player, regardless of offense or defense, in football, and probably has been for the last at least 2 years. TJ Hawkinson, tight end for the Vikings, he's someone that really should have made the Pro Bowl last year, but didn't for whatever reason. He's already been to the Pro Bowl, I think, 2 or 3 times. He's certainly in the conversation for best tight end in the NFL, as Travis Kelce and George Kittle start to age out of being in that conversation. Justin Jefferson, you could argue he should be in the lock category, but ultimately, if he were to retire today, I don't think he'd be in the Hall of Fame. But if he could just exist for another 2 or 3 years, instant lock, probably honestly first ballot type of guy. Penei Sewell is arguably the best offensive lineman in the NFL. Frank Ragnow is in the conversation for best center in the NFL now that Jason Kelce is gone. Some would argue he is the best center in the NFL. If he can stay healthy and get himself another 2 or 3 years of high-level Pro Bowl caliber play, he will be in the Hall of Fame conversations. Sewell just needs to keep doing what he's doing. He's probably going to switch to left tackle after this year, but he just needs to keep doing what he's doing. So the 50-50 tier is for guys who, generally speaking, are older players whose careers are kind of past their prime at this point, and I'm not sure they've done enough to warrant the Hall of Fame. There's one player on here that is still probably young enough to change that, and he's near the bottom. We'll get to that in a minute. But Alvin Kamara, running back for the Saints, he's certainly past his prime. When he was in his prime, he was a very, very good player, but I don't know if he is going to have the cumulative stats and awards to really get into that Hall of Fame discussion. Brandon Scherf is the same kind of player, had a really good 3 or 4 year stretch, and then outside of that has kind of just been a solid player. Shaquille Leonard was arguably a top 3 defensive player in football for a period of time. Injuries kind of derailed his career and went downhill after that, as well as coaching changes. CJ Mosley has just been a model of consistency. I'm not sure he's ever been a top 5 linebacker in the NFL, but he's been in the top 10 pretty much every year he's been in the NFL. Xavier Howard, corner for the Dolphins. I don't think people remember how absolutely phenomenal he was when he was in his prime. He was maybe the best corner in the NFL for a period of time, an elite caliber player. But that was shorter than a lot of, I would say probably most Hall of Fame players' primes. And before that, he was a young player trying to figure out what he was doing in the league. And after it, at this point, he's a veteran corner that nobody wants to sign. So I don't really know if he's done enough to get in that conversation. Might be more of a Hall of Very Good type of player. Same thing with Teron Armstead. He has, I believe, had some injuries in his career, but ultimately, at this point, he's an older player who's still playing at a high level, but probably just doesn't have enough left in the tank to get all of the accolades that he will need to get into the Hall of Fame. Wyatt Teller, somewhat similar. It's a little bit more fickle with offensive linemen because you can be very, very good and not make the Pro Bowl because the casual fan doesn't give a shit about offensive line play. But Wyatt Teller was a very, very good football player. Just don't know if he's done enough to get in that conversation. Amari Cooper is the one player that I was alluding to earlier who's still young enough that he might be able to do something about this career because I believe he's only like 30. Like, I think he turned 30 this year, and he's still probably got another 2 or 3 years of high-level production in him, and he has made 5 Pro Bowls, but I don't know if he's ever really been in that conversation of like a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL because there have been so many good wide receivers. But if he can keep producing and keep getting 1,000 yards, 1,000 yards, 1,000 yards, you know, making Pro Bowls even because he's, for whatever reason, a very popular player as well, then that conversation could absolutely change. Darius Slay is another guy that I actually kind of lean more towards putting him in the good chance tier, but I am, as a Lions fan, very biased towards Darius Slay because I watched him play at a Pro Bowl and All-Pro caliber level the 3 years before he made his first Pro Bowl in Detroit. So I am kind of biased towards him because I know how good he was in a game in, game out sort of situation before he ever got the national recognition that he deserved. Danielle Hunter, an edge rusher for the Texans now, is someone that has been very, very good the past few seasons, but has kind of been a tier, maybe like a tier and a half below the like truly elite caliber players. He has also had some injury problems, and it was a little bit of a late breakout in terms of when his elite caliber play started relative to when his career started. But a tremendously good football player who could still add to his resume and kind of put together his Hall of Fame case still. Moving on to the good chance tier here. These are all players that I think probably make the Hall of Fame. I wouldn't consider them locks, but it would definitely surprise me if they didn't get in at some point. Derwin James, who, had he not gotten hurt so many times, would have undoubtedly, in my mind, redefined the way we talk about the safety position in the NFL, because that's how good he was in his prime. Cam Hayward is someone that we don't talk about. Same with another Cam that we'll get to in a minute. But he's really, really good. And he was like the best player at a position that was kind of getting relegated out of the NFL. That like 3-4 interior defensive lineman where you got to be able to play anywhere from head up on the nose tackle to outside shade on the offensive tackle. Just a really, really good all-around player who deserves more recognition than he gets. Kyle Juszczyk is someone that I don't think most people would think is going to be in the Hall of Fame, but he's made like 10 Pro Bowls and like 8 first-team All-Pros. And just because his position doesn't have stats that you can kind of look at doesn't mean that he isn't a Hall of Fame caliber player. Like, he's arguably the best fullback, in terms of the way that we modernly describe fullbacks of all time. He's a tremendous football player, and I think he deserves recognition for it. Justin Tucker is also a very good kicker, probably the only kicker in the league right now that I think has a chance to make the Hall of Fame. Mike Evans, wide receiver for the Buccaneers, probably should put him in the lock position, but man, looking at his career, I don't know if he's got enough times being like a top 10 receiver in the NFL. I don't know if he's got 7 years of top 10 receiver play, but he's probably going to make the Hall of Fame off of the longevity and consistency. Cam Jordan is another guy that was never in that like truly elite tier conversation, but was like just below it for like 9 years straight. But a very, very good player that nobody talks about for some reason. But he, when it's all said and done, is going to be a Hall of Famer, I think. Harrison Smith, another safety for the Vikings. We've forgotten how good he was during his prime because it's been 2 or 3 years, but he was very, very good. Keenan Allen is another receiver that, again, has had history with injuries and stuff like that, but he does have the accolades. He does have the reputation. He also has the cumulative stats to be in that conversation. Locks. These are players that are going to make the Hall of Fame. They might not be first ballot Hall of Famers, but if they retired today, one of which might actually retire today, but if they retired today, they would make the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. That's Devontae Adams, wide receiver for the Raiders, who maybe once Calvin Johnson retired, kind of had his own like mini stretch of dominance, or he might have been the best receiver in the NFL. Khalil Mack, edge rusher for the Chargers, sort of in that same tier as Cam Jordan, but I do believe he won Defensive Player of the Year. I could be wrong, though. Yeah, no, he won it. He won it in 2016. He won it. Phenomenal football player. Absolutely deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Travis Kelce, arguably the best tight end in the history of the NFL. I think it's still probably Rob Gronkowski, but Travis Kelce might get Gronk on the longevity factor. Chris Jones, probably right now, would be considered like the best pure pass rusher as an interior offensive lineman. Again, I think Dexter Lawrence is probably the better overall player because he's the best run defender in the NFL and also maybe the second best pass rusher on the interior in the NFL. But Chris Jones, he could retire today. He's in the Hall of Fame. Same story with Quentin Nelson. Came in the league and was like the best guard in the league. Had like a 5-year stretch where he was unquestionably one of the best offensive linemen in the NFL. Kind of tapered off the last 2 seasons. Don't really know why, but still a quality football player. Patrick Peterson, at his peak, he was the best corner in the NFL. Tremendously flexible. He could play press man. He could play off man, press zone, off zone. He could work underneath. He could go deep. It didn't matter. He returned kicks. Phenomenal football player. Myles Garrett, again, came into the league, was arguably a top 10 edge rusher. By his second season, he was top 3 and has just been in that conversation the whole time. Joel Bitonio, offensive guard for the Browns. Again, we don't talk about him. He's one of those players that we don't talk about, but then you look at his career accolades on Wikipedia and you're like, holy shit. He made 3 first-team All-Pros, 2 second-team All-Pros, and 6 Pro Bowls. And it's like, holy crap, that's what a Hall of Fame guard looks like, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to the second group of players here, Matthew Stafford is absolutely a Hall of Famer. After this season, he's going to be top 10 in passing yards and also probably top 10 in passing touchdowns. He's got a Super Bowl win. He doesn't have the Pro Bowls, but that's because he played the majority of his career in Detroit, and Detroit is not a big market in NFL terms, and other more popular players who he was significantly better than made the Pro Bowl over him because it's a popularity contest. Bubba Baker is another guy that we don't talk about, but he's phenomenal. A fantastic player who's been an elite caliber player pretty much from when he came into the NFL until literally still today. Like last year, he was great for the Cardinals. Nobody watched the Cardinals, but he was still a really, really good player. Matt Ryan is also in this locks tier. He did get that MVP. He's there. He's been retired for a couple of years, and I probably shouldn't put him in this list, but I wanted to put him in here anyway. George Kittle is also a lock for the Hall of Fame. Really, really good player. Probably one of the 5 best tight ends ever to play the position. That's just my opinion, though. Bobby Wagner, linebacker, for most notably Seattle, but also for, I think he played for the 49ers for a year, and then the Commanders is where he's going to play this year. Came into the league and was just fantastic, and then he made 9 straight Pro Bowls for Seattle, and just a very, very, very good football player. He should walk into the Hall of Fame, and they should welcome him with open arms. Lane Johnson is another player where early on in his career, he was kind of considered a bust, but really put it together, really figured it out. He was kind of bouncing all over the place on that offensive line, left tackle, right tackle. I think he played guard for a couple of games, but settled in at right tackle and has been a very, very good football player for the Eagles. Should make the Hall of Fame quite easily. Stephon Gilmore is another player that should make the Hall of Fame very easily. Got that Defensive Player of the Year award, which is tremendously hard to do for anybody that isn't an edge rusher or Aaron Donald. So he got that while those sort of players were in their prime. Should walk into the Hall of Fame fairly easily. Tyron Smith is, I think, in the conversation for top 10 left tackles in the history of the NFL. A tremendous physical talent and still playing at a decently high level to this day. Moving on to the last tier here. These are the first ballot Hall of Famers. They could retire today, one of which did, but, well, not today, but this offseason, and then they would just walk into the Hall of Fame. Patrick Mahomes could retire today and be a Hall of Famer, and would probably be, I think right now I would still have Peyton Manning over him, but he would probably be the 3rd best quarterback in the history of the NFL. Jalen Ramsey, cornerback for the Dolphins, is also in the conversation, in my opinion, for greatest cornerback in the NFL. A just elite caliber corner, even in the context of the history of the NFL. Tyreek Hill has been a borderline unguardable in the NFL for a significant amount of time. He's a first ballot Hall of Famer. Von Miller is the same type of edge rusher as, a TJ Watt or other players that we have talked about here. He's going to walk into the Hall of Fame. Don't let the past few years let you forget how good Russell Wilson was for Seattle during his prime. He was a phenomenal quarterback. He was a top 5 quarterback in the NFL for almost a decade. Do not let recency bias let you forget how good Russell Wilson was. He changed the way we evaluate the quarterback position because of how good he was. He's a great player and an all-time great at the quarterback position. In my opinion, probably one of the 10 best ever to do it. TJ Watt is another guy he could retire today. He's going to make the Hall of Fame. But he's going to keep playing, and we're going to have a very uncomfortable conversation when he's done on who was better, TJ or JJ. Trent Williams is arguably the best left tackle in the history of the NFL, and he's going to walk into the Hall of Fame whenever he decides to hang him up. Zach Martin, again, just a model of consistency, came into the league, was a top 5 guard in the league, is still probably a top 5 guard in the league. And final player on this list here, Jason Kelce, center. He just retired this offseason. One of the best players in the history of the Eagles, one of the best players at the center position. I'm going to be honest with you, I can't think of a player at the center position, not necessarily the interior offensive line, but at the center position that I would have rated higher than him in the context of like the all-time conversation. And that is all that I have. Oh, wait. No, it's not. Am I forgetting someone? Wait a minute. I think I am. Yeah, that's right. He is most notably known for his time in the AFC East, and also is made like 10 first-team All-Pros, and is arguably in the conversation to be the greatest player of all time at his position, even though maybe not necessarily he himself, but a lot of his decisions and stuff going around him was shrouded in controversy. That's right. You know who I'm talking about. The man, the myth, the legend, Matthew Slater. Now, I know you are all familiar with this legend of the game, so let's run through his accolades. I know everybody knows his accolades. I mean, it's like no-brainer. It's Matt Slater. This is a 10-time Pro Bowl, 3-time second-team All-Pro. Should have probably been first-team All-Pro all of these years as well. But, you know, you get bored of just slapping him up there on the first-team All-Pro, so you got to, like, you know, voter fatigue and all that. You've got to throw somebody different in there sometimes. 5-time first-team All-Pro, 3-time Super Bowl champion, indispensable on those teams. You could not take him off the team, and they would win those games. He is an essential player. Okay, now that I've kind of gushed here a little bit about Matthew Slater, who absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame. Special teams is 1/3 of the game, and he actually played special teams, unlike someone like Devin Hester, who made the Hall of Fame for no reason at all. But I don't need to get into that. This video is already like an hour and 15 minutes long. It doesn't need to be longer. But obviously, the player I'm actually forgetting to talk about is Aaron Rodgers. If we're just talking about on-field play, Aaron Rodgers is in the conversation for greatest quarterback of all time. He's an all-time great, and even though he has been in some controversies regarding the weird kind of crap that he does in the offseason and also some political nonsense that I'm most certainly not going to get into, I just kind of thought it would be funny to leave him off the list, like I was going to make some statement about him or saying that he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame because he's overrated or whatever. I just thought it'd kind of be funny to do that. But that is actually, for real this time, all that I have for you today. So at this point, I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with it at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.